Hello and welcome. My name is Johanna Koljonen and this is Crosstalks. For those of you watching for the very first time, Crosstalks is a collaboration between Stockholm University and the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH. We are airing live from the student house at KTH, and our studio audience is exclusively made up of students from the two universities. As for you viewers, we hope to once again break the geographical record. During our latest broadcast, you were watching in 49 different countries. Enough bragging. Let's dig into the first topic of the evening. The way we humans grow and consume food is pushing the limits of what is possible on this planet. Our consumption levels of meat and fish in particular are becoming an ever greater challenge. At the same time, different scientific breakthroughs when it comes to creating and perfecting foods do seem to offer hopeful directions for the future. What are some of the solutions to our current overconsumption of meat and fish? We would tonight like to explore whether today's scientists could be better than farmers at growing food. Joining us in the studio are Line Gordon, Deputy Science Director at the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm University. Welcome. Eva-Lotta Thunqvist, Associate Professor Land and Water Resources Management at KTH. Welcome. And Victor Galaz, Associate Professor in Political Science, Stockholm University. Welcome. Please give them a round of applause. Eva-Lotta Thunqvist, everybody seems to be talking about economic growth, and we know from the media that this is what our governments are interested in measuring. But you emphasize something called green growth. Could you start by describing what that is?
Yeah, when you talk about economic growth, then you think that the economy is the limit. But if you consider that the Earth is actually the limit, we are living on only one planet, but we consume things as we have here in Sweden, 3 planets, which is a bit of a problem for all of us, I would say.
In the context of food production, then, I'm thinking often in the newspapers, I seem to read things like organic farming won't work because it's so small scale that the economy demands somehow, the idea of financial gain demands food production and animal husbandry on an industrial scale. Do you think that that is a false dichotomy?
It depends. It's true in a way because you measure things by the very short horizon, and you look at the economy at the moment. But economy is actually to take care of our resources. That's the fundamental meaning of the word. So that you should actually take care of the resources in the long run. And in the long run, that means you have to be ecological, to take care of our earth, the soil and the water we have.
Yeah, that's great. I just realized, as you say, yes, economy means actually taking care of resources rather than maximizing profits.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Victor Galaz, part of your work is in the field of emerging technologies. How hopeful are you when it comes to technology's role in solving the complex food crisis we're in?
Well, I think I'm both hopeful and realistic. I'm realistic in the sense that many of the problems we're facing today are not about technology. They're about waste, they're about inefficiency, and they're about diets, essentially. But then there's a stream of different technologies that could help us on the way. Some of them we see already being diffused, for example, mobile technologies in Africa that provide microinsurance, microfinance, information, for example. And then there's more things on the crazy edge of technology would be like robotics and artificial intelligence for farming, for example, or synthetic biology. But I see a broad span of technologies that could help us, in a way, create more food. But at the same time, to acknowledge that there's limits to what technology can achieve, and there are more serious problems that are not that cannot be addressed by just technology.
You mentioned waste there. That's wastefulness. That's again being uneconomical with the food that is actually being
There's
produced.
A lot of food.
I'm very curious about how mobile technology can help us solve food problems. Do you have a practical example of that?
I know from Kenya, for example, mobile technologies are making a very big impact in all sectors. And for agriculture, for example, you can get a microloan as a farmer by getting it easily to your mobile and also paying with your mobile. You can get weather reports through your mobiles. You can get access to market information, essentially knowing where is the best way to sell your commodity that you're producing, depending on market prices, for example. And that's just one of the early things that we're seeing at the moment. And that helps, I mean, that's helping small-hold farmers at the moment.
Lena Gordon, your research focuses on governing freshwater for food. Could you describe the challenges in food production from your perspective?
Well, I think from my perspective, one of the fundamental challenges is how we actually manage our landscapes better to provide both food production, but also water resources and what we call ecosystem services, which are basically the benefits that nature generates for humans. The food is one of the benefits, but there's others. There's pollination, clean water, carbon dioxide sequestration for climate regulation, etc. And if we think about the challenge we're facing, we're going to be 9 billion people on this planet. We probably have to double food production or something like that. And the amount of water that's required for food production is enormous. So I usually ask my students about how much water do you think we use on a daily basis? And they usually answer in the range of 20 to 200 liters per day. But for the diet that we eat, we actually eat around 3,000 liters of water every day.
That's the amount of water that's gone into producing the food that one person eats during one day?
Exactly. But it's the amount of water in terms of rainfall that falls on the crops that the crops need to be grown. So that's an enormous amount of water. We use 70% of all the water that we use is for food production.
I think here in a country like Sweden, where fresh water is one of the most abundant resources, that this would be a problem is incredibly difficult to sort of fathom. But we are in the midst of a kind of freshwater crisis, globally speaking, right?
Yeah, it's a very good question because I think we don't really see it here. In Sweden, it's a lot about the water pollution and putting too much nutrients in the water. But in some of the regions where I work, you have several problems coinciding in the same place. So you have very dry conditions, very limited water resources. You have big population growth, and you have high levels of poverty. So and high levels of malnutrition. So in most of the regions where we actually have this population growth happening, and where we will need to increase, where food demands are going to increase the most, are also the most water scarce regions in the world.
Yes.
Just a comment there, and also in Sweden we import half of the water that we need, so-called virtual water, to produce food and to produce clothes and other stuff like pads and pods. So
with virtual water, does that mean that we're spending it somewhere else?
Somebody is spending it somewhere else, and we import half of that. Although we are a country with lots of fresh water with good quality, we import it from places on Earth where there is a scarcity right now, and this can't continue, of course.
One aspect to get an incredibly practical level then was something that's very trendy now. I find from following the media is urban farming, and there's an idea that's being, maybe at least in the lifestyle sections, mentioned a lot, that we could solve some parts of the food problems by growing food extremely locally in cities and even in our home. You're all nodding. How realistic is this?
I'm nodding because I think it's nice to have urban farming, and I think farming sometimes can also be sort of a way to almost reconnect to nature and have some nature experience. I'm maybe not nodding because I think that's where you solve most of the food needs. I think that can be a complementary source, and it can also provide maybe some insurance if we would have some problems in cities. But I think most of the food production will take place in landscapes outside of the cities.
It's good to say insurance. If we have problems in cities, that's a way of saying if the food transport system were to collapse because of weather or conflict,
exactly,
people would not starve as fast. Yes,
right. And it's maybe good to have some, when more and more people live in urban areas, it's maybe good to keep also both some knowledge about how to do food production, but also that we have some capacity to grow some food.
Victor,
I agree with Lena. Just there is a more positive spin to that. essentially that the majority of the world's cities that we will see in 2050 haven't been built yet. And it would be really fantastic if we could build them in such a way that we actually create more ecosystems and ecosystem services as we become more urbanized. I mean, there needs to be some sort of positive vision in that movement.
That's fantastic. Yes, Eva-Lotta.
Yeah, and also I agree with both of you, and I also think it's a very pedagogical thing in this, because you actually get to think about where does your food come from, and that we have left. We are buying it on ICA or Coop or wherever, and we need to actually reconsider and think about where is the food produced and what is the resources needed.
Joining us now on Skype, I hope, is Pamela Ronald, professor in the Department of Plant Pathology and the Genome Center, University of California, and co-author of the book Tomorrow's Table, Organic Farming, Genetics and the Future of Food. Welcome to Crosstalks, Pamela.
Hello, glad to be here.
Thank you. And I see that we have also been joined, it's fantastic, by Wesley and Jarrell, Professor Emeritus of Sustainable Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Welcome on the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be.
Pamela, in your book, you argue that if we continue with our current farming practices, vast amounts of wilderness will be lost, millions of birds and billions of insects will die, and billions of dollars will be lost in value as a consequence of environmental degradation. What do we have to do in order to avoid this scenario? Because that does not sound good.
No, that's not good. And other panelists spoke about, we have issues with water. 70% of the fresh water is already used for farming. And we also have to produce more food on the same amount of land, because most of the land is already being farmed. And to complicate that, we have pests and diseases and environmental stresses that can take about a 70% bite out of agricultural productivity. So we very much need to turn to sustainable intensification so we can produce more food on the same amount of land with less water, and do this with fewer toxic inputs.
Do we know how to do that? Or do we need a lot more new science to figure out how to solve that?
I think we do know how to do. I mean, of course, we have issues, political issues and food waste issues. All those absolutely must be addressed as well. But we also know that if we use an integrated pest management approach and use less toxic types of pesticides, we use new crop varieties, if we bring these different approaches together, we really can advance sustainable agriculture.
Professor Jarrell, you and your wife are the founders of Prairie Fruits Farm and Creamery in Urbana, Illinois. You are producers of organic food. What is the biggest challenge you face as producers?
I think right now, looking into the future, a couple of the biggest problems are related to the climate variability, which all farmers face, of course, and then the potential for increased insects, other disease we're going to be facing in the future. I think those are two of the biggest things. I think also in the general public about where their food comes, how it's produced, what it impacts the environment, the social dimension.
I'm sorry, Professor. Sorry, the sound is coming and going. We're going to have. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to stop you there. I'm sorry. We'll see.
Sorry.
Let's just see. Let's try and say something. Let's try and say something brief. Yes.
Okay. Does that work better?
Yes, so far. Let's see.
Still hearing an echo. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Well, just that I think we suffer the difficult sustainability challenges of economics, environment, social dimensions of what we're doing.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The sound is not working. I hope we can come back to you, Professor Jarrell.
Okay.
In that case, I'll just turn back to you, Pamela, and actually all of the panel as well. If we know how to solve this problem, why haven't we done it already? Professor Ronald.
Well, we have each farming system has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, the issue facing farmers in developed countries are very different than the issue facing farmers in less developed countries. And in many countries, such as the United States, we have very high levels of productivity, and many farmers are moving to using more sustainable practices with less toxic inputs. But in other parts of the world, they have very little access to, for example, new seed varieties. Perhaps they don't have access to water, to fertilizer. So there's political unrest. So there's a lot of complicated social and economic issues that are contributing to poor productivity in many parts of the world.
Line, you've worked in a project in Burkina Faso and Niger. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned there?
And I think it's very interesting because in Burkina Faso and Niger, yield levels are extremely low. So, say we often talk about 10-ton agriculture. In some of the farmers I'm working with, they have maybe yield levels of 500 kilograms per hectare. And this is of sorghum, millet, and maize are the main sort of crops they're growing. And the challenge there is how do you sort of close what we call the yield gap, so get the yields up to a higher level. And I think there are a lot of we know quite a lot about how we could improve small-scale technologies. So these are also some of the poorest countries of the world. They're on the lowest bottom of the Human Development Index and so on. So you need to find solutions that fits in these local conditions. So some of the techniques we work with are, for example, stone bunds, where you collect stones from the field and you build sort of walls in the landscape that stops rainfall and infiltrates so more water gets into the ground. Anyway, so there are all these small-scale technologies that are not so difficult to use, that could be implemented, that's very low cost, but they're often very labor-intensive. And one of the main challenges is why are they not taken up on a larger scale? And I think that has to do with many more social aspects than the actual technological solution. So it has to do with farmers' visions of the future, where they have the possibility of investing in what they want to basically do in the future, and also about this enormous sort of labor cost that it takes.
But I wonder, Victor,
Yeah, I just want to follow up. I mean, I agree with Lina, and I think there is an additional dimension to it, is that you don't only want to push down innovation now and implement it, you also need to maintain innovation over time. So essentially that community in Burkina Faso does not only innovate once, but also need to maintain that innovation capacity. I mean, if we move into a 2 to 3 degree warmer world and we have other environmental changes, how would you make that community to continue to innovate over time and share the insights with other communities?
Well, I mean, it doesn't sound, to me it sounds, I mean, this is when we're talking about building a wall out of stones to stop rainfall, it's technology on such a fundamental level that many of us, I'm sure, aren't even thinking of it in terms of technology. But I guess basically, fundamentally, the challenges are the same regardless of which kind of agriculture you're on. Okay, that's very interesting. Eva-Lotta.
Yeah, I was just thinking that industrial agriculture does not pay its price now, its full price. That's why, I mean, you are pushing the debt to the next generation.
We're spending too much water and also too much oil, which we haven't covered
and we are
yet.
so. And when we are polluting the soils and we are not returning the organic material, and this is something the future generations have to deal with. So I mean, it's pushing the debt in front of us towards.
In that case, my layman's question is, I guess, that maybe, I mean, to me it sounds like we have maintained too much of our innovation capacity. We started inventing things without thinking about the consequences in some parts of the world, and in other parts of the world, we're not even building the stone wall. You're looking very doubtful, Victor.
No, I mean, what's the best? I mean, if you have a certain future ahead and you have these huge challenges, 9 billion people, climate change, how are you going to prepare for that without promoting new ideas, testing out new things, sharing insights with other people, and constantly learning? I mean, for me, that's one of the key components.
Lina?
But maybe we haven't been so good at the capacity to learn and to evaluate whether our innovations are good or not. So how do you actually sort of monitor your success? I think that's one of the things that we might be failing. Just sort of an example, in one of these projects I've been involved in, that was actually in Tanzania, but we could see that through the small-scale system innovations and technologies, we actually got quite a bit of increase of yields, especially in years when there was quite a bit of rainfall. But then the farmers, they had to store this, the extra crops that they got, because they couldn't sell it because it was a good rainfall year, so they didn't get, so the prices were quite low. And then they had enormous problems with storage pests. So I thought that examples just illustrate how I think also in general we need much more systemic solutions. And sometimes I think agricultural solutions have been quite sectoral. You solve one problem, but you sort of create something else. So you have to have this more systems approach to finding the
and also it's not just that you need the systems approach. Yet when we're talking about solutions, it tends to be, oh, consumers have to do this, or farmers have to do this, or something. But I do have to raise one part of it, which is the role of lifestyle change or cultural change, and the role of the consumers. I think, at least in the global north, now there is a high awareness that we should be eating food that is good for us and for the environment. But there is on a very practical level the ecologically produced organic, as they're called in English, unscientifically they are called this in English. The organic products are much more expensive, and there is a huge resistance on the individual level of making the transfer to these products and recommitting a much larger part of our income to the food that we buy. How can we, I mean, surely the individual consumer or the consumers as a collective do have a part of the responsibility? Or do we? Yes, you're all nodding. Pamela?
Yes, I think the organic production practices have really been very helpful in raising consumer awareness of the critical issues facing food production. However, just buying organic food does not solve all our agricultural problems. So in some cases, for example, strawberries here in California, the organic growers will use less methyl bromide, which is a quite toxic and potentially carcinogenic substance. And they combat diseases in that case using crop rotation. But there's other examples where organic farmers don't have the tools that they need to combat disease or pests or environmental stress. And in that case, sometimes organic farmers are actually using more land and more water and more toxic inputs than another farmer. So it's not as simple as buying organic products. We really need, as some of the other panelists have said, to really look on a case-by-case basis. And especially in light of the changing climate, where we're expected, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change expects increasing floods and heat and drought. How do we adapt our agriculture to those different environmental challenges? And go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, this is terrifying to me, frankly. I wonder whether anyone, I mean, you guys are pretty clued in, but I wonder whether, I mean, whose responsibility is it? What you're describing is an incredibly complex set of problems that is going to require systemic solutions, means things like international treaties probably, and regulatory action. Is there anyone qualified to make those decisions? Do you see what I mean?
I think I see what you mean, but I think it's hard to say that it's anyone in particular's responsibility, but it's a responsibility that goes across all sorts of levels. We need individuals taking responsibility, but also individuals promoting and supporting decision makers to take difficult and make difficult decisions, and so on. And I think sometimes also the food. A lot of the challenges really meet on the plate that we eat, basically. So how can we find more inspirational ways of thinking of how we can eat in a better way? So we just started to talk with some chefs in Sweden. There is a Swedish Chef Society to see, can we work together with the people that are actually setting the menus and inspiring us to cook in a good way, to see if we can find ways that is more inspirational and creative of how we can eat in a better way than we're doing now.
So that would be,
And-
let's say, the cultural approach,
Exactly.
changing lifestyles and going through the general public.
Exactly.
Eva-Lotta, what would you suggest? Whose responsibility is this?
I think whose responsibility is difficult, but I think you have to go through your heart or through people's heart. I mean, you have to really. I mean, like chefs is some way to do it. The food is a way to do it, but you have to really reach their heart. And I mean, most of us we know about the climate change, and we know about that the food may be not healthy, but we are still eating it, and that's a problem, I think. Yeah.
Victor?
Well, as a political scientist, I just want to add the role of politics and economics. And I think about it every time I buy milk. Like, why ecological versus regular milk? It's so stupid that ecological milk is more expensive. That's an indication of a system failure. Yeah. And the question is, how would you change the system, the economic incentives and the institutions to change that balance, right? It shouldn't be cheaper to buy bad milk.
Yeah. And really the only reason why organic products are more expensive than non-organic, whatever you call it, products, is because they're subsidized by nature, basically. So it's nature. We can think about that. We have 3 capitals. We have natural capital, that's the land, water, ecosystems that provide different benefits to us. Social capital, and we have economic capital. And we're basically producing food in ways that are draining down the natural capital. So that's sort of that's the way that we can keep food cheap.
Subsidized by the future, essentially, and that future is coming closer and closer because we're talking about the next few decades now.
I was thinking about the concept of economic growth. I think that should be on the agenda as well for political discussions, because you think about the economy as that is the frame for everything. Instead, it actually is the earth, the soil, and the water.
I agree, and I wonder how realistic it is to get that change to happen fast enough, because this is an emergency now. Pamela?
Yeah, I'd like to just point out, so my husband's an organic farmer. I'm very supportive of organic production, but I think it's too simplistic to say that organic food is somehow going to be more sustainable or more nutritious. In fact, the scientific evidence indicates that organic produce is no more nutritious than conventional produce. And in some cases, organic farmers will spray very toxic compounds into the environment because they don't have a lot of methods to control disease. So, for example, they'll spray copper compounds, which can accumulate in the soil and become very toxic. So it's too simplistic to say that organic agriculture is somehow going to solve the problems. And often it takes more land and more water. So it's more expensive, often because it requires more labor, more tilling, which contributes to global climate change. And it also requires more space. There was a new study out indicating that on average, most of the staple food crops have a much lower yield, for example, 30% lower yield when they're produced organically. So that's not for all crops. There's some fruits and vegetables that yield very well, and organic farmers could grow very well. But the issue is that organic farmers are limited by the different approaches they can use to control these pests and diseases. So I think, as some of the speakers have pointed out, we really need to look on a case-by-case basis. And I really liked what Victor said, is we need to be open to new technologies and new ideas. And really the criteria should not be conventional or organic. The criteria should be, how can we enhance the sustainability of our food systems?
Victor, some voices have been raised concerning re-establishment of extinct species. To me, this sounds like complete science fiction. But could it be possible to bring back extinct species, and could this help us somehow in solving this problem?
I mean, it has been done for a few selected species. I've heard about a frog that was extinct a few weeks back. But the links to food production are quite vague, and I'm not sure that particular, but I mean, there's some ideas about synthetic biology, for example.
So synthetic biology, that's things like growing food in I'm just guessing now. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, the idea, there are a few research groups working on that, is to mimic and to create artificial photosynthesis. So essentially you would boost the potential in crops to use photosynthesis and build in more energy in the crops that you get from the sun. I mean, that's the main idea. It hasn't been really proven yet, but there are some ideas about how to do it and different sorts of materials that you could use. I just have to,
am I understanding this correctly? We would have plants that would store solar energy more efficiently for us than to eat.
For us and for energy production.
And
energy is key in food systems, right? I mean, if you can get out more energy from the sun, then actually that loosen up a lot of other issues in agriculture as well.
But a big part of this future debt that we're talking about has to do with the fact that so much of our farming is so incredibly dependent on, as you say, it's energy. So in practical terms, it's about oil. We're driving big oil-driven machines to produce and transport our food, and that becomes part of the cost of the systemic cost that the earth cannot bear. And this is why I think many people in the green movements around the world are doubtful about the role of technology, saying, well, that became such a big part of the burden the last time around. And I have to say, as a sort of layman, I mean, another one of these future technologies would be the growing of protein in vats that we sometimes hear about, the man-made hamburger and so on. It sounds to me like we are maybe not prioritizing the resources of the research correctly. My gut feeling is that it's probably the real answers are going to be more building stone walls and less inventing de-extincting species or things like that. Eva-Lotta?
Maybe protect the species that are threatened at the moment of extinction. That would be, and also, I mean, we can't photosynthesize things. We are dependent on the green vegetable, because either through animal or directly through us, we are dependent on them, and that's really, I think, I'm more into the basics. I mean, to protect and to increase in a simple way.
Victor?
No, I'm just thinking that, I mean, the nature of innovation is that you don't know where it's going. So maybe the lab-grown meat will recombine with some other weird idea and just create a huge revolution. And we don't know that, right? I mean, that's the principle of innovation. I mean, what you would need is diversity of ideas that you test out in small scales, and then eventually recombinations of these ideas could have really, really big impacts that are positive.
Yeah, no, I also think that there are, I mean, if you look globally at the global land surface, it's basically almost 40% of our global land surface is used for some type of agricultural production. So it's either crop production or livestock and grazing. And I think we don't do well enough with that land. I think there's huge opportunities to improve both productivity and work together with nature in a better way than we've been doing on the land that we already have, and that's sort of what Pamela was saying also. So I think there's so much more we can do by combining ecological knowledge with hydrology and agronomy, and really sort of bringing more disciplines together. I see that as a larger challenge and more possibilities than the lab type of technology.
So the good news is that so many students around the world are watching this right now going, oh, but I have an idea, and every idea is needed for that diversity, the diversity of thought. But still, I would like for you to tell me what our politicians should do as citizens. I think we still have more power as citizens than as consumers, and we should lobby our leaders to take decisive action to do what exactly? Where do we start in solving these systemic problems? Are there any sort of specific kinds of regulations that you could think of, or anything that would really help? Let's start with Pamela.
Well, I'm a researcher and I work in the nonprofit sector. And so, of course, what I'm going to say is that we need to support publicly funded research. This really is essential for improving plant productivity. And of course, as other speakers have pointed out, there are many other aspects to agriculture. But just basic improvement in how to combine the best seed varieties, logically based, is very important. An example from a project that I've participated
Oh,
in.
just a moment, Pamela. Your sound is going. Let's try that again. From seed varieties, yes, please.
Okay, so I wanted to just mention a project that I was involved in that was a publicly supported project. With global climate change, we're seeing many more floods every year. 25% of the world's rice is grown in flood-prone regions. So a number of years ago, the United States Department of Agriculture funded a project to a colleague of mine to try to understand the genetic basis of submergence tolerance. So there are some varieties of rice that can stay underwater for 2 weeks and then survive the flood. And this publicly funded project led to the development by the International Rice Research Institute of a new rice variety that can survive 2 weeks of flooding.
That is amazing.
And it's been very helpful today. 4 million farmers in Bangladesh and India are growing this rice variety. And I think it's a really nice example how publicly funded research can directly improve the lives of poor farmers. And we needed an international collaboration and funding for this type of research.
Thank you.
So plant geneticists are very, very hopeful. We know that there is a lot that we can do to provide new varieties for farmers in the developed world and less developed world, and that in combination with ecologically based management practices, we can really boost sustainable food production.
That's fantastic. What about you others? Let's say, so publicly funded research, obviously, I think as researchers, you will all be for it. But it's wonderful to see that it has these kinds of results. What else? What else should we do? Where should we start, Lina?
I mean, one way that we've been working a little bit with at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where I'm from, is to talk about the planetary boundaries. And I think that was also discussed in one of the previous crosstalks, but to really see where are kind of the limits of resource use across the several different sets of resources. So for carbon dioxide, for water, for land use, etc. And a lot of those boundaries that the scientists have been identified, that basically if we use more of this of our resources, we run the risk of hitting really big thresholds or big collapses. And a lot of those, our use of resources towards those boundaries are actually pushed by agriculture. Agriculture is one of the main drivers behind this, getting close to these boundaries. So I think really trying to identify some of these boundaries that we shouldn't cross, and also at different scales. So for Sweden, what are the kind of limitations that we have? Can be one way to kind of constrain, to understand what the constraints are for production.
So that would be providing really better and easily comprehensible, perhaps as well, basis for legislation.
Exactly.
To understand the consequences will be too awful if we cross this line, so we can draw some lines that should absolutely not be crossed.
Exactly, and also setting them in a way that within this boundary, it's fine to experiment and be innovative and try new ways of doing things. So you combine it with both, like, here's a limit, but within this space, it's okay to experiment. Sort of.
Very good. I think we have a question from Skype. Oh, this is a pre-recorded question on our website. It's possible to pre-record questions for the panel. Let's see what our pre-recorded visitor has to say.
Hi, my name is Henrik. I am 20 years old. I'm reading a master here in Sweden in environmental science. I would like to lift the topic about overfishing, because fishing is a big interest of mine, and I can see how this problem interferes with my personal interest. Every year, scientists create these recommended quotas for the fisheries to keep the populations at a sustainable level. But the decision makers exceeds these recommendations 2 to 3 times, which in the end will result in collapse and have big influence in the ecosystem and such. So I would like to ask you, what do you think it would take to get the decision makers' attention to this problem, and how can we get them to realize how important this is from both an environmental perspective as well as an economic one?
That is a very good question. Does any of you know anything specifically about the overfishing issues? A little bit, yeah. Eva-Lotta?
We are trying out aquaponics systems, KTH at KTH, and that is because most of the fish we eat here in Sweden we import, almost all of it, and this is a way of growing fishes and vegetables in closed systems, so you won't pollute the waters from it. So you have, for instance, we have tilapia, which is fed by mostly vegetarian substances, and then the wastewater from the fish tank goes to the tomato plants growing, and they take out the nutrients, and then the water is clean and going back to the fish tank. So that is a way of trying to implement systems which are not polluting, for instance, Baltic Sea or other lakes in Sweden or rivers.
That's right. So one answer, because we're still going to need the fish proteins, is to produce it outside the natural systems where overfishing tends to collapse.
And then of course it's important how what you feed the fishes. So they should be mostly vegetarians. Then otherwise you have the problem because you feed the fishes with from the Atlantic or from.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Absolutely. So on the let's say the top level question, I guess, was how do we get the attention of the decision makers? So I guess in your respective fields you will have come across similar problems. You have very valid scientific information that you need decision makers to act upon, and then they don't. So do you have strategies for this? Who is in error here? I mean, clearly decision makers aren't doing enough, but what do we do about this, Victor?
Thanks. That's a very difficult question. I mean, I think the question really brings out that overfishing is not essentially a technological problem, it's a political one. And how do you get decision makers' attention? I mean, it's all about public campaigning and how you vote, et cetera, et cetera. And there are many levels here that goes all the way from the national to the regional to the international. I have no clear answers to that, but I mean, it's a big important issue.
Lina?
Yeah, I think we tend to talk quite a lot about individuals and then also decision makers, but I think the business sector is also a sector that sometimes we tend to forget, and there are actually companies that are willing to go ahead and actually take these aspects seriously, and I think also sort of engaging more actively also with the business sector is very important, and sort of the forming dialogues about these issues at quite a high level, I think is very important there to get the change to happen.
We're going to take an audience question in a moment, but I just like to add to that, to say that many commercial actors, many companies have started acting on this because they are very aware that when these systems collapse, their whole industry will disappear. Yeah. So of course that's become something. Eva-Lotta.
Yeah, I was thinking I think you really need the good examples. That was why I was talking about. I mean, urban farming or trying to implement systems in other ways, because that will start a discussion, and then you have a dialogue with the politicians, because you have to reach them so they get interested, and hopefully this could be on the agenda next year for election. I mean, if sustainability would be a question, that would be really nice, I think.
That's right. Do we have a question from the audience? Yes, please, ma'am. Right over there. Oh, I caught two of them. You first. Okay, you first.
Yes, hi. Hello, my name is Rosa, master's student urban planning. I'm now taking a course called Future Studies and Forecasts, and we're working with scenarios. And my question is whether you use scenarios in your research, and whether you think it's useful to use it in the food issues.
That's very good. Who would like to start? Lina?
I can start. I've used the scenario work quite a lot, and I think it's extremely useful. The way that we used it is in the way of what's called scenario planning, and that is you develop alternative stories about the future, how the future can unfold. And sometimes some scenario work is more building one vision and then look at pathways to get there. Others are to explore what are alternative ways. And I think there are so many things that we don't really know will happen in the future. So these sets of different futures is very useful. And I think we've also used it in our work with the farmers in sub-Saharan Africa to look at what are alternative development pathways in these small communities. I think it's quite easy to get blinded basically by your project vision. So you find a technology for how we increase productivity in this agricultural system. And then you implement it and you measure kind of, yes, it increases yield, and then it doesn't sort of take off because you don't really understand the bigger development of the whole community. So we've used it to explore, like, how is this type of technology actually robust in different futures? And that's been extremely useful. It's been very interesting also to understand the social context more of the project.
Thank you. Let's take the other question. Thank you. I hope there was an answer. There you go. I'm doing this because we're running out of time, as one always is with interesting topics. Yes, please.
My name is Wendy, and I'm really interested in knowing what you think of the role of animal production, or how we raise animals today, in the problems that you're presenting tonight. I understand that most of the land that is used for agriculture is used for food that is fed to these animals, and that leads to them being, or this production of animals being, the main reason for the contamination, the problems we face with water and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. So what would you like to say about animal husbandry? Pamela?
I'm a plant geneticist, and I'm mostly vegetarian, so I'm probably not the best person to answer, but I think there's an increasing demand for meat around the world, and we need to produce animals more sustainably. But of course, if we could have cultural changes where people in the developed world perhaps cut back their meat consumption to once, twice a week, that would have a huge dramatic effect. Some people say that just cutting food waste and reducing consumption of meat would address a large part of the challenges we faced. But realistically, this is probably not going to happen very quickly. So we really need to produce animals in a very efficient manner as well. And perhaps the other panelists have a little more experience in that area.
What would you say?
I would say that it's interesting to see that we're in a phase where these norms are changing. At least I don't think it's just Stockholm based. I think at some point you reach what some people call peak meat, that you stop eating more meat and essentially think about the environmental impacts you have, and maybe you will see a decrease in meat consumption because of awareness. But we're in it at the moment, so I don't know where it's going. In that
case, I would like to ask you this. How many of you panelists have decreased your own meat consumption as you've become aware of these issues? Everyone. Except Pamela, perhaps we can't see your hand. Yeah, that is interesting. Yes, as well.
I'm frustrated because I began when I was 15. I became a vegetarian. I thought, well, that was all our world food problems. And as you can see, I'm much older than 15 now, and that's not going to solve all the problems because we have countries that, for example, China, they're eating a lot more meat. So it's not as simple as just cutting back on our own meat consumption in developed countries.
Well, I guess that was one answer to the question, at least, is that it does help. It is one answer, but it is not the answer. You know what, guys? We're running out of time, and we didn't solve the global food crisis during this panel. I'm a little disappointed, but I'm also inspired. I mean, terrified and inspired, as often happens when we talk about these topics. Thank you so much, Eva-Lotta Johansson, Thunqvist, Line Gordon, Victor Galaz, and Pamela Ronald. And we also had, for a very brief moment, Wesley and Jarrell with us. That is all we have time for in this first talk. If you're at home or at the office, go grab a cup of coffee. We'll be back on the hour with robots, children, and linguistics. See you then.